All right, we're live. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Gary.
So, welcome to Topic Discuss, where you give me a topic as the audience and then we discuss it. And we have been given a topic, Brad, about critical race theory. And I think we had a meeting together in one of our places of work. Um, and I realized you had a passion for racial equity. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of taking a few minutes to talk about why you have that passion, and then I'm going to ask you some personal questions.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Well, thanks, Gary, for having me on. It's always good to chat with you and respect what you do. So flattered to be part of the conversation. So yeah, I'm another middle-aged white dude who has probably no place talking about this kind of topic, but I do have a lot of energy around it. So I think my perspective on this goes back to when I was growing up. My dad was a newspaper guy, and he was working up through the editorial ranks, and not a lot of money to be made there, but he had a lot of passion around that. He cared deeply about journalism, its role in free society, and especially about local journalism. But to do that and to make it work and to work up to where you got onto the business side of the house for newspapers back then, you really had to bounce around the country. And so we moved a ton. We lived in like 17 homes before we settled in St. George when I was in sixth grade. So we moved a lot, mostly in the West. And as we would move, I had to learn how to make new friends all the time. So I didn't get good at making deep friendships, like the best friend kind of thing, but I got very good at making new friends with the expectation I was going to leave in 18 months. And one of the things that I discovered was that some of the people who were most likely to be friendly toward me were those who didn't have as many friends. And almost always, these were people of color. They were, Latin American kids, they were Asian American kids, they were Black kids. And so I became very close with a lot of those communities in my youth. One of my friends, Sammy, when I was in grade school, his mom didn't speak English. They were first generation immigrants. And so I didn't ever think about it in terms of race. I didn't ever think about it in terms of, some of the history around race in America. As I've gotten older, I can now place the conversations that I had and some of the things that I experienced as a kid into a different construct. And it's just one of those things that for me really strikes home. I have a very deep visceral reaction to things that are fundamentally unfair, when power is being leveraged in an unfair way, especially when it's done over time. And that's absolutely the story of race, not only in this country, but around the world. And so it's something that's fascinated me. It's something that I think is really important. I don't think it has gotten nearly enough attention in the right ways. Critical race theory, which I know we'll get into, is a very unfortunate way that it's gotten sort of taken sideways. But it's one of those things that, again, I went through kind of all the classic public education courses and went all the way through AP history and still didn't really learn about the things that were really going on in this country around race. Supplemented that education through a lot of reading since then, and the events of the last few years have really pushed that envelope even more for me. And I've tried to dig in and understand what's been going on and why. Seeing this kind of energy in the public space, for me, makes me ask the questions: what's going on? What's behind it? Where does this emotion? Where does this energy to demonstrate come from? So that's a little bit about kind of how I've arrived at some of my feelings as a white dude.
Well, so this is inevitably going to be a controversial discussion because we can't talk about critical race theory without talking about religion and politics.
Yeah.
My two favorite topics, but certainly can be controversial. So if we were to kind of wind back the clock to pre-Brad being born, who are your parents and how did they come about, so we know how you came about?
Sure. My parents come from very different backgrounds. My parents got divorced when I was 18. My dad grew up, for the most part, in Indiana and in Utah. His family moved from Indiana to Utah when he was 12, 13, 14, something like that. But he sort of had his formative years in the Midwest. But before that, his family traces back to Norfolk, Virginia. So our ancestors on his side came over on a boat. The story that I've heard, some of it's probably true, is that there were two brothers in Germany. Both of them were supposed to get on the same boat to Brazil, where most of my family with the Prothow name are even today. One of them got drunk the night before, got on the wrong boat, went to Virginia. So my dad's side traces back to Norfolk, which is, as you know, literally the birthplace of slavery in the United States. And so I have family in the South, in Southern Virginia still. They migrated west and eventually ended up in Utah, joined the LDS Church along the way. So that family line is colored by, the history of the South, the antebellum South, also, kind of the Midwestern Rust Belt way of life, but also Mormonism and also democratic politics. My dad's family are all Democrats. So, and my dad's journey was very different. I mean, one time he considered himself a small L libertarian. So he's kind of bounced around looking for an ideology that resonated with him politically. I don't consider myself partisan, and I've never seen a political party that really spoke to me. But I think my dad went through that same thing. My mom is from Alabama, and she's a convert to the LDS Church. She had a pretty difficult upbringing. Her family in the South, kind of low socioeconomic status, and my grandfather, we called him Granddaddy. He worked in an aluminum plant, died of cancer early. My grandmother on that side, I never met her. She died of alcoholism really early as well. My mom's upbringing was tough. She joined the LDS Church, moved to Utah, and met my dad. So I had this kind of interesting background where I didn't come from in the LDS tradition. There's the theology and there's also the culture. And a lot of people who are from Utah or live in Utah, I was born in Provo. Their backgrounds go back to, the pioneers who crossed the plains, forced west because of a religious persecution. I don't have that story. My family has been converted to the church later on, and certainly bring some of, the nuances that come with that. On my mom's side, I can distinctly remember my granddaddy, one of his pet names for me was Honky. So, I mean, there were these kind of, and I didn't know that was a racially loaded pet name. It was just something that he called me. So, and I remember going to Alabama to visit them, and you'd see Confederate flags, and there's all the kind of like hallmarks of the sort of Confederate South down there. But that's kind of my background with my parents.
I didn't realize you were born in Provo, Utah.
Yeah,
I was too. We have that in common.
Interesting.
Now I grew up in Provo. Yeah, I was born in Provo. How long did you were born in Provo, but did not stay there?
No, again, my dad was my dad was going to BYU at the time, and he was trying to also moonlight as a journalist, and eventually, left school early, like a semester and a half away from graduating. Later on, got his bachelor's degree in his 50s. So went back to school later, but just followed the job. So we were kind of all over in Utah. We were in Ogden. We were in Salt Lake County. We bounced around all over the place in Utah. We went to California for a time. So my sister was born in Central California, kind of Grapes of Wrath country, lived in Idaho Falls, southeastern Idaho. So a lot of moving, a lot of bouncing around, mostly in Western states, but didn't stay in Provo for very long.
So did your parents meet in Provo at BYU?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just I have a wide spectrum of viewers across the globe. And so just a pause for the viewers, Brigham Young University is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints university. It's owned by the church. And so many Mormons will go to BYU and study, but they also oftentimes find their spouses and get married. I went to Brigham Young University. Did you, Brad? I can't remember.
Utah State.
So Brigham Young University is the private school of the Mormon Church. So your dad and your mom converted prior to meeting and getting married, right? So they were already had a faith-based life, same religion.
Right.
And then are you the oldest?
I am. Yep, oldest of three.
And then tell the viewers about your siblings.
Yeah, younger brother named Jeremy, a couple of years younger than me. So he lives in Idaho Falls now. When my parents divorced when I was 18, I stayed in St. George. My sister, who's 2 years younger than him, stayed in St. George as well. We lived with my mom. My brother went and lived with my dad in Idaho and finished his high school up in Idaho Falls. So he lives in Idaho still. And my sister is back east now. She's kind of bounced around. She was in Oregon for a time and has kind of migrated her way east and is out on the East Coast now.
And in your family, who still maintains a faith-based life, and who, you don't have to share anything that they don't want you to share, but is everybody pretty oriented to the faith, or?
They're pretty open about this. So my dad left the church around, that was really kind of the impetus for the divorce, right? So my dad was, I remember my dad, he's a very serious thinker. So, and he's very into critical thinking. And that for him led to a path away from the church. There were things that he couldn't reconcile. And that meant for him also, eventually kind of like there was no church that really resonated with him. So he's definitely, I think, spiritual, but not religious. I remember him bringing books on like Taoism and Buddhism to sacrament meeting, right? So he always was really interested in religion and spirituality, but that he's left the church and is not in the church now. My brother isn't either. My sister isn't either. They've all kind of had their own paths and their own reasons for that. My mom is still very active in the church, and I'm still active in the church as well. So we're kind of split down the middle.
Where does she live?
My mom, so they have been in St. George until the last year, and they sold their house. Oh. She and my stepdad, they bought an RV and they're RVing full time. So their home right now is in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, but month to month, it could be anywhere.
So how did the divorce impact you in terms of, I have a lot of questions about that, but to start with, how did the divorce impact you in terms of your faith? And did that have any impact on your view on, racial equity?
Yeah. So I don't think at the time it affected my views on racial equity. I think that's been more something that has been colored by my experience with friends and with people. It's more been the way that I've experienced socioeconomic class, because you really can't separate socioeconomic class and race in this country when you start to understand, the history behind, all these forces that have converged over time, right? So the divorce didn't really change anything there, but it certainly affected me spiritually. So I think everybody, if you grow up in any religion, you sort of absorb it. It becomes the air that you breathe. It's just, you take it for granted. It's sort of, it's taught to you. I guess in our home it is maybe a little bit different because we were exposed to a little wider view of things, given my dad's kind of spiritual search. There was never any sort of antagonism toward the church in our home. It was just sort of like, look for truth where you can find it. And that was really, it was more kind of a critical thinking lens. So the timing was interesting because when I was in high school, it was still customary that LDS missionaries, boys went out when they were 19. That was when you were eligible to go out. Now that's changed to 18. But I was 17 or 18 when the divorce happened. And that was sort of a forcing mechanism for me. Like, my dad's not in the church anymore. My brother's gone to live with him. My mom wouldn't mind probably having me at home during a very difficult time in her life. And do I really want to do this? Do I want to go spend 2 years actually knocking on people's doors and trying to convert them to a religion? And so kind of a forcing mechanism for me. I mean, I did dive into, spend a lot of time in, kind of the holy texts for Mormonism, which are the Bible and the Book of Mormon, and then a book called the Doctrine and Covenants, which is sort of the writings of Joseph Smith in the last 200 years, and the experience that he had when he was restoring the church. That the LDS Church believes that Joseph Smith restored the ancient church that was lost back to the earth. And so spent a lot of time in those books. There were things that I resonated with, mostly at the principle level. I sort of separate principles from practices in my mind, and I felt good about it. So, I became, I think, fairly solidly grounded on the theological principles of Mormonism, not as deeply rooted in, some of the cultural things that are embedded in the church even now, but felt really, like I should go on my mission and spend those 2 years doing that.
What are those principles? Do you feel good about?
Yeah, I think the main one that resonates most with me is that so there is a heavy emphasis on finding truth. If you kind of distill Mormonism down to the original doctrine that Joseph Smith taught, there's this idea that truth is things as they were, as they are, and as they are to be. So it's sort of looking at things objectively and saying what's real, what's true. And there is this notion of constantly seeking for truth, and that there's a struggle to find it. It's not always obvious that you wrestle with. One of the things that you wrestle with as a human being is the difficulty in discerning between truth and error. And that to me really resonates. I experience that all the time. We all do if we're paying attention. And there are a lot of times where my biggest insecurity is, I think that's right, but I'm not totally sure. And so that resonates with me. It also, this is especially true since I've had kids. There's a notion in Mormonism that you're on a kind of eternal evolutionary path. That the potential of a human being is tremendous, and it's eternal in nature, that you're always going to be in a state of progression if you choose it. This gets a little hairy, but when my kids were born, immediately you see personality that seems to be, not taught or learned, but sort of just in their nature. And you see as they get older, some of those things, they pick up things. They certainly are influenced by their environment. And I don't know if, the things that are sort of inherent to them are things that I've passed on or my wife has passed on, or some recessive gene in their personality that's being expressed through them, or if it's something that's just, there's an intelligence inside of them that has existed for a long time. And this is a stage of their life that exists in like this kind of mortal body. And then maybe after they die, their intelligence lives on and can take, different forms and can continue to progress. And so there's a notion there in Mormonism that I feel like there is some truth to. Not something I can prove, not something that I have like full assurance of, but it resonates with me. I also think, when I look at the progress of humanity on things like dealing with disease and figuring out how to kind of hack the human body, I feel like there's this idea in simulation theory that if anybody could ever create a simulation and put people into it, if that was ever possible, it would have already happened. And that means we're currently living in a video game. Kind of a silly notion, but similarly, if there had ever been a human being who figured out how to like crack mortality, figure out immortality, and then learn how to create like a society that people can coexist in like harmony, that would have been created by now. And maybe we're all working toward that someday. That in its essence is kind of the message of Mormonism that resonates with me. There's kind of all these hokey things on the side that in my view, we get very distracted with, but that's the central stuff that really sings to me.
You sound a little bit like a Mormon transhumanist.
Maybe.
Does that ring a bell to you at all?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And that's probably right.
Yeah. For the viewers who, and many of our viewers are atheists as well, but I think I know that many of the viewers also know about our church pretty well. They know about our church history, and they know about, some of the social issues in the church. So I think it's helpful when, you're willing to be vulnerable and say, this is the part of the church that is appealing to me. And a lot of viewers don't know that. A lot of viewers don't recognize that, for Mormons, for some Mormons, and I feel this way too, Brad, is that, there's this kind of culture to continuously improve, progress, and that means something that you can do forever, that, it doesn't just end, your life just doesn't end here, but you can continue your progression hereafter. Now, I know that there are viewers who are also going to say, well, what about all these other issues with the Mormon church? And they'll also say with all churches, there are issues. But so I'll bring one up that relates to race. When and you and I were born after 1978. Well, I wasn't. I actually was born in 1974. but I was only 4 years old when this happened. In 1978, the Mormon Church lifted its ban on um, African Americans, Black Mormons, from holding the priesthood and participating in temple ceremonies. So prior to 1978, Black men and Black women could be baptized, but they could not participate in priesthood ordinances or hold the priesthood, I should say, and participate in temple priesthood ordinances. So I remember, but I didn't know that, Brad. I didn't know that until I went on my mission. I went on my mission to the south, to Lynchburg, Virginia. I have other episodes about that, where I met Jerry Falwell, et cetera. But and I was in a neighborhood, and for those that don't know, as Mormon missionaries, or you do know, we knock on the door. If you watch South Park, they knock on the door, and this lady answers the door and says, "I cannot believe I would never join your religion because you are racists. You believe in segregation." And I was like, she's crazy. I don't know what she's talking about. But the thing that I didn't know at the time is that she was right. At a point in our church, um, we did segregate, if you will. We said, whites can hold the priesthood and go to the temple, blacks cannot. Um, Even so much so that there was even, interviews when blacks were looking to join the church, or and from other countries. There were questions of or interviews to make sure that we understood if they came from that lineage of Cain or whatever. So I bring that up because I think, like you said, part of growing up in any faith, um, for me anyway, what I recall about growing up in our faith is, the community, the sociality, the love, right, and the opportunity to serve and volunteer. So but I had no clue about our history, which was fairly recent, right? This is 1978. So when you talk about the principles that uh, attract you to a faith-based life, particularly Mormonism, how do you reconcile your passions about racial equality, given not just our church, but religions past in inequality and oppression?
Yeah, I think it's a big question that plays into a lot of the culture war stuff that we deal with right now, which is, can you criticize something that people hold in reverence without you sort of casting doubt on the entire thing? And I don't look at it that way. I don't look at questioning practices, for example, as being something that means that the principles are bad. It just means that the practices have gone astray. And I think that one of the most distracting and poisonous ideas is this idea of exceptionalism, which exists in a lot of faiths, including in Mormonism. Certainly exists, with kind of the nationalism we see with Americans as well, where it's infallibility, basically, that everything that we do is great because of who we are. Everything we do is justified because of who we are. It's sort of like this manifest destiny, like God is blessing what we do. And I don't believe that. I believe that, and I think that there's also a sort of a set of concerns and fears, probably from people who are in positions of leadership, but also from the rank and file, American citizens, members of the LDS Church, probably members of other faiths, where people say, well, if you cast any kind of question about some kind of major practice or institution, that you're chipping away at the foundations. And we just heard, public officials, very prominent public officials, say this in regard to CRT. Like, well, if you're willing to think about, the possibility that America institutionalized racist policies, then you really are kind of eroding the foundations of America. So you can hold, in my mind, you can hold two ideas in your mind simultaneously. One is that the principles of that something is founded on can be pure, they can be good, they can be worthy, they can be everlasting, evergreen, eternal. But also, as people start to get a hold of those principles and they start to create institutions to scale up those principles and take them to more people and institutionalize them, and then the practices grow out from that, you get corruption. And there's just no way around that. And that's true for, if you believe the story that, God inspired Joseph Smith to found the LDS Church and restore, gospel doctrines that had been fallen by the wayside and authority to act in God's name. Everything that he does, or everything that people who come after him do, must therefore be infallible. You're going to run into some real problems. And the way that I reconcile those things is to recognize that when we even say within the church that, the individuals who God has entrusted with the church are human and therefore fallible. And I don't think we take that far enough. I think that, I can look at somebody personally and say, here's all the good things that they're doing. Here's all the things that they're doing to uphold principles. And here's the things that they're just off base on. And I do that with myself. We're all fundamentally, kind of broken in certain ways. We've all made big mistakes and small mistakes. And in some cases, when you're in a position of power, the big mistakes reverberate for a long time. And I think the doctrine of blacks in the priesthood in the church was, in my view, just fundamentally wrong and racist. And I think it grew out of a place where the church went astray. The early church was really predicated, when Joseph Smith was founding it, on this idea that they were going to align themselves with this idea that's in the Book of Mormon about God being no respecter of persons, bond or free, male or female. And the way that principle was distorted over time is that, again, in my view, you've got disparity between the genders. You've got disparity between races. You don't see a lot of racial kind of reflection in the church leadership until recently. That started to change a bit, which is great. You also see policies that I think are based on, fear and personal bias around LGBT individuals. And certainly that was true for blacks in the priesthood. And I think that I would find it faith promoting, not faith eroding, if the church were to say, look, that was just a mistake. That was, the errors of man. That was not something that should have been purported to be some kind of doctrine coming from God. I think we're going to have the same moment with LGBT communities in the future, where we say people are going to be forced to sort of reconcile, like, this was just a mistake. But for me, again, that doesn't change the fact that I believe the principles. Same thing with, the American nation. I mean, the principles that were articulated in the Declaration of Independence were phenomenal principles that were fairly groundbreaking. And then from the word go, they write the Constitution, and immediately, like, you've got the 3/5 compromise, which directly mathematically contradicts the idea that all men are created equal. Well, 5/5 doesn't equal 3/5 for a black slave, right? So I just think that, there's always a gap, can be big, can be small, between our principles and our practices, especially when you institutionalize things. And that's what I view blacks in the priesthood as.
So let's see. I'm just trying to think about sequence of events, because you brought up a lot of really interesting topics. And I'll say, with our church, and for the viewers who don't know much about the church, is that the issue with blacks in the priesthood and withholding that from them, and our temple ceremonies from them, was not really talked about. In fact, there were lots of apologetics out there to try to justify why we did this, right? And including apologetics that are damaging to the race, like they are less valiant in the pre-existence, or some other, or seed of Cain, that Brigham Young kind of came up with. But what the church did in 2014 is it did come out with an essay, an official essay or official doctrine that disavows those apologetics. It disavowed, the pre-existence thing. It disavowed the seed of Cain, all of those components, and it actually did say Brigham Young was probably or was a racist, right? And not a lot of people know about those gospel topic essays, but in a way, that transparency and talking about the history as it was, rather than like, one of our past prophets who didn't want to talk about these things, President Ezra Taft Benson, he would say, I just want church history to be faith promoting. I only want faith promoting stories. The seagulls ate the crickets, and everybody cries in sacrament meeting, right? But there is power, isn't there, in um, understanding the full truth and the history, because when we don't do that, then there are lingering beliefs that people continue to hold on to, like a pre-existence idea or a seed of Cain idea. And I still see that those ideas are held by members of our church and other religions. Um, so I'm not, but I think for future generations, we can, you know, uh, fix that problem. Now, I'm not saying that and I will give it to the church, our church, that this transparency and transparency over lots of different issues in our history, including polygamy, and I do a polygamy episode on my podcast as well. But the church is being very transparent and not watering down that history, putting the information out there for us to study on our own. And for some, that creates a faith crisis. For others, it doesn't. But is that what we mean by, I'm going to dovetail into critical race theory, where we explore the true history and how that history institutionalized racism across a broad spectrum, that it's not just an individual one-on-one racist encounter, but that it's embedded in our structures. So I said a lot there, but I want, if you could, to educate the audience on your understanding of critical race theory.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perfect on-ramp to this, because you said something in there around, the idea that Ezra Taft Benson wanted things to be faith promoting. And I think that for me, people who are hiding things or trying to whitewash things or create kind of a narrative that's really like not rooted in fact is actually faith eroding. And I think that for people who are serious about trying to get to truth, it's faith eroding for them as well. There's this idea of that I sort of refer to it as like spiritual Red Bull. You've got people who show up to church and they're just looking for a shot, some kind of like juice to get the momentum going, and it's not very deep. I teach gospel doctrine, which is like Sunday school in my church congregation or ward, and I talk about not getting out on branches but staying closer to the trunk. And I think the trunk is these principles, and like, who gets out on branches? People who are trying to get away from principles, and that happens all the time. We also, in our faith, advocate very, very strongly for this idea of repentance. That we live in a fallen world. There is no perfection to be found here. There's only effort toward improvement. And why would that not apply to the institution? Why would that not apply to the leaders of the church? Why wouldn't any institution that holds very sacred its principles hold itself to account and expect that it's going to go astray and have to be held to account? And when it goes astray, recognize that, acknowledge it, and commit to be better. I think that's faith promoting. And I think the same thing is true. The echoes of what you just mentioned from Ezra Taft Benson are absolutely reverberating right now with critical race theory. So there's really two narratives that are battling against each other right now. One is this notion that, the kind of the very simplified story without nuance that I grew up with, that I was more or less taught, is, you had European sort of conquest that came to America. These were people who were looking for opportunities to expand not only economic opportunity, take advantage of resources, but then build civilized society. So Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue, finds the American continent for Spain, and then this sets off like this land grab, and You sort of like have maybe a token mention of conflict with the existing native populations that were here, but then you get sort of silly stories about Thanksgiving dominating everything, and this was really kind of an amicable situation. And then from there, you get these oppressed British citizens in the American continent who are really getting the screws put to them by King George and by the British, which is true. Again, two ideas can exist simultaneously, and so they decide to break away. And then they found this nation on these great principles. And from there, yeah, we had like the moment with slavery, but we got better. We repented of that. And once we got rid of slavery, everything has sort of been pretty hunky-dory since then. We live in a place that values and treasures equality. And really anybody who questions that is, one, trying to rewrite history and be divisive, and two, creating a victim mentality that perpetuates people who stay in poverty forever. So if you're a Black man and you're finding yourself in poverty, it's really easy to cry foul and say, well, that's not fair. The deck's stacked against me. And this is a place where everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Everyone has an equal playing field. And that's a nice story, but it's absolutely fundamentally false. And again, critical race theory has become the boogeyman for a culture war. The latest, it's the latest in a long line. You've got Sharia law, you've got Common Core, you've got evolution taught in school, all these like fear-based things. They're coming for your kids. They're coming for your suburbs. Like, it's a tale as old as time. It's been recycled over and over again. It's a political ploy. And so really, when we try to understand critical race theory, I think the big picture here is when you zoom out, you have to be willing to sit with something and say, hey, is this country, can you accept the fact that this country is founded on great principles, that there are a lot of people who have tried to adhere to those principles over time, and that some people have tried to adhere to most of those principles, but been found wanting in some of them. For example, founding fathers, they put their blood on the line and their lives on the line to separate from England because of certain oppression that was happening, but also weren't willing to give up their slaves until they died. And so can you see both the good and the bad, both the alignment with principle and the misalignment with principle in those same people, and just recognize the complexity and the nuance of a person, of a period of time, of an institution? And so that's the level of open-mindedness that's required to understand the conversation around critical race theory, because it's much bigger than just some purported doctrine that's being pushed in schools. That's a silly oversimplification. It's not true to begin with, but also it prevents people from, it encourages people to react with emotion and shut down thinking and conversation, to see things in terms of absolutes and blacks and whites, and to see things in terms of zero-sum game, instead of looking at things in their complexity and their nuance and looking for truth.
In reality, it's kind of lazy too, right? You have to suspend critical thinking and just take the word of your Facebook page or from your favorite news, right?
Yeah.
So critical race theory, I actually had a discussion this week with a different group about the origin of critical race theory, and it really came, a part of it is a team of attorneys were developing this theory, and when you think, so in science we would talk about a hypothesis builds this evidence around a theory. In law, a theory is more about, it's a little bit different than science. It's building potential case. So what could you with what you know, expound a little bit on that term, what we mean by that term, where it came from?
Yeah, for sure. And you're right. I mean, again, to hear a lot of the kind of political rhetoric around critical race theory, let's start with what people have sort of like been told it is. This is a doctrine taught by leftists, extremists, that has made its way into schools. And the doctrine is something that teaches that America is an inherently racist country, that white people are inherently racist, they are beyond hope, and that the only real answer here is, kind of a shift of power and resources away from white people. All these like very incendiary ideas. And if you're a white kid, if you're a white third grader and you're taught this, the obvious implication is that you're a white third grader, you've done maybe nothing wrong, you're just an innocent kid, but you should feel bad. And you owe something to society because of something that happened in the past. And so that's absolutely wrong. So again, the origins of critical race theory is that this is, first of all, it's not being taught in schools. This is not a curriculum. It's a framework. And it did started with legal scholars. And so if you're a legal scholar, it started in the 70s, right? So you've got these academics who are legal scholars in university settings, and their job is to understand aspects of their field in depth, and then to advance the scholarship in those areas. And if I were a legal scholar looking at the history of law in this country, there are some dots that I would start to connect that would lead me to understanding history of America through a racial lens. So for example, I mentioned it earlier, you've got the Declaration of Independence, which probably you could view as a legal document. You're saying to your sovereign authority, the King of England, we're breaking away from you on these grounds, and we're going to form a nation based on these principles. And one of the first principle that's articulated in the Declaration is all men are created equal. And so you have articulated a principle that you intend to codify into law. The Civil War, or sorry, the Revolutionary War ends, and then a decade later, they finally get the Constitutional Congress together, and they have an opportunity to say, okay, can we bake those principles into the first legal document for this country? And the South at that point had centuries of slave labor baked into their economy. The entire American economy was predicated on free labor, exploitative labor. So since the 1600s, they had been importing slaves and benefiting from slave labor to build the most dominant economy in the world. And so when the southern states say, hey, we're not on board if you're going to take slavery away from us, you've got an impasse right there, right? You've already seen the seeds of the Civil War being planted at that point. They also, though, say in the South, but you know what? We also want to get representation for our slaves. So they come up with a three. We don't want to count them as human beings because they're really property. But when it comes to getting a seat in Congress, we do want like a little bit of credit for them. And so you get this compromise. And then from there, you actually codify slavery and inequality into the Constitution from the word go. And certainly some of the founders, I'm sure, were squirming in their seats. They knew this was wrong, but they lacked the political power and will to be able to reconcile that. And then, you go for a long time before you actually start to see any real progress, culminating with, again, like when the Civil War hits, things have gotten so bad that they're like, look, slavery is a stain on this nation. We've got to get rid of it. It creates an actual war within the country. And then after that, Reconstruction happens, and there are efforts to go and actually not just free slaves, but 40 acres and a mule, give them land, reparation, give them a chance to participate in the economy, give them a chance to run for office and be part of the civic society and be part of Congress. But what you see happen after that is that, especially in the South, Reconstruction is completely rejected because of mob violence. And the state and the police actually were either turning a blind eye or participating in intimidation toward Black people who were trying to participate in society as freed people. And so that is, you have the legal entities of the state and law enforcement either tacitly approving or explicitly approving of mob violence, rifle clubs, the KKK, real like lynchings, real violence against Black people for trying to participate in an equal way with their white counterparts. Then you get into, you've got the Black codes, actual laws on the books that would prevent. So for example, if you were offered work by a white person and they wanted to pay you a tenth of what they would pay somebody for the same job, and you choose not to take that job, well, now you're guilty of a crime and they can enslave you. And even after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment had a clause that allowed for slavery if you were guilty of a crime. So, okay, there's a loophole. Let's exploit that. And if you're guilty of a crime, then we're going to basically reclaim your slave labor. You get into, the later periods where you actually see the Jim Crow laws take effect. The Jim Crow laws were the Nazis, the Third Reich actually cited the U.S. Jim Crow laws as like a global legal precedent for what they were trying to do with the Jews. They said, is there any place in the world where you actually have state law that explicitly allows for racial segregation? And they said, oh, Jim Crow. They sent people over here, the Germans did, to study it and to bring it back with them. So you got voter suppression, you've got violence, you've got the housing authorities, the VA were explicitly trying to keep Black people out of homes that were backed by the government. The insurance agencies were in on this as well. All the redlining, all these notions were predicated on this idea that racial equality should not be allowed to exist. Otherwise, we would have all kinds of social problems, right? So when you look at history through that lens, if you're a legal scholar and you see the law actually codifying or tacitly allowing racial inequality to persist, you have centuries of groups of people based on their race, disadvantaged based on what kind of housing they can get. Can they vote and obtain power through political representation? Can they get a good job without being discriminated against? Can they pass on generational wealth through the equity in their homes, through being able to have access to good jobs in a close proximity to where they live? I mean, the fact that people look at the word ghetto is thrown around pretty cavalierly now, but that is the construct and the result of housing policy predicated from the federal and state governments. That was people look at that and they go, well, all these Black people just sort of like collected themselves in inner cities. They were shepherded there, right, by housing policy. So in the 70s, after kind of the apex of the civil rights movement, it would be natural that you would have academics in the legal field saying, let's take a look at history through the lens of race and see if, to your point, a hypothesis is true, or if it's testable, to say, how has the law played a role, if any, in creating systemic inequality in this country based on race? And that's critical race theory.
So just to be clear, excellent, Brad. And I don't think I could find a more succinct description of this than just right then. So thank you for that. What I think is so powerful about how you start is, again, to simplify, critical race theory started with legal scholarship, looking at our historical context from a legal lens, which is common in law, right? I know that there might be some viewers who are going to say, well, those are just a bunch of liberal, I don't know, liberal judges or liberal whatever. But the truth is, all legal scholars and even Supreme Court justices look at historical precedents, including our Constitution. And so critical race theory does and did look back at the historical context of where race was codified, or racism was codified, inequality was codified. And it's brilliant that you start from the beginning of our laws in this country, the Constitution. And what I want to emphasize for all viewers or anyone listening is that the Constitution codified racial inequality by saying that a group of people are worth less than another group. And it's still in the Constitution today. It's still written that way, right? I mean, we've amended the Constitution, but I go ahead.
Yeah, there have been a lot of amendments that have rectified that. I mean, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments are really what most people cite to say, hey, this was post-Civil War. The North had won. The Confederacy really represented the cause of slavery. And this is one of the reasons why, again, as a small tangent, there's so much angst against Confederate symbolism now, like Confederate statues, Confederate relics and symbols, the Confederate flag, the word Dixie. We've experienced that in Southern Utah, right? Because it was one of those things where in the South, they had at first an economic advantage that came from exploited labor. They then convinced themselves of a dogma that justified it. And if you were to, like, James Henry Hammond, I think was his name, the vice president of the Confederacy, gave a famous speech called the Mudsill speech, where he basically articulated an idea that God had foreordained people with black skin to be subservient to their white masters. This was God's way. And that's where a lot of the roots of what we've even seen spring up in Mormon theology come from, is this idea that it was baked to justify a convenient economic model, right? But even then, when the North won the Civil War and said, we're going to rectify these wrongs that were baked into the Constitution from the beginning with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, even the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, said no one can be enslaved except for punishment as a crime. Well, you have very easy to document examples of how that was exploited. So even then, they had an opportunity to remove completely that issue, and they didn't do it. I mean, even into the 80s, like the mass incarceration has largely been possible because of some of the things that were not rectified in constitutional amendments. So it's no longer true that the Constitution will say, hey, there's a mathematical inequality between people of different races, but there are ways to look at the Constitution still and say, hey, have we gotten everything right? When you look at all the case law and the Supreme Court judgments that have come down since then, there's a lot of things. I mean, even right now, there are efforts pretty naked efforts, transparent efforts to bring back some of the essence of Jim Crow and prevent black people from voting. Jim Crow laws didn't say we're going to discriminate against you on the basis of being black. They just targeted things that were more common in predominantly black neighborhoods or parts of the country, and said, okay, well, in these places, we're going to give you a literacy test, and we're only going to give it to black people. Like, that was kind of the wink and the nod, right? So there's a lot of ways that have been that this kind of this idea of systemic racism have been perpetuated through the years. And again, I think the core tenet with critical race theory is that racism, first of all, is not just an interpersonal problem. It's a spectrum. First of all, like, it's not like you're racist or you're not. Like, we all have biases, unconscious biases, and it's not just reflected in how we might act toward another person. It's also reflected in how you make policy and how you create laws, how you legislate, how you rule in Supreme Court cases. I mean, we have the Dred Scott case, the Plessy versus Ferguson case. There was a Supreme Court decision at the end of the 1800s that struck down part of the Civil Rights Act at the end of that century that said that you can't discriminate on the basis of race with regard to housing. And that's what allowed an entire century of discriminatory housing policies to proceed that destroyed generations of wealth accumulation for black people and put them at a distinct disadvantage. So those are all the ways that you see, again, the Constitution being weaponized by people who are looking for ways to weaponize it. It's not always as explicit as, well, the Constitution says black people are bad and white people are good. And it's just much more subtle and nuanced than that.
So I know that, so when you talk about American exceptionalism, whenever you hear, and I hear this from religious people mostly, including members of my own family, and that the Constitution's perfect, right? And the only amendments that we should have ever had were the first 10. What do you say to that, Brad?
Yeah. Well, first of all, for people who are of our faith, I would just point them to the last general conference, which is the global conference for our church, where the top leadership speak to members of the church and have them listen to Dallin H. Oaks' talk. Now, Dallin H. Oaks is a very conservative guy, and he's a guy who comes from a background of, he was a clerk on the Supreme Court. He spent a lot of years studying the law, and he's a legal scholar, and he's also the number 2 person in charge of our church. And he said explicitly that the Constitution is not perfect. And so again, I always go back to that framework that I've mentioned, where, if you're willing to acknowledge that human beings are inherently fallible, why would the institutions that we create be anything different? You have a principle that's perfect. And the hard work is to try to get your institutions and your practices to be as close as possible to that principle, which is, it's difficult in the best of circumstances. It's impossible if people are fighting a battle to suggest that we've got it right, don't even question it.
Right.
That's really, it belies all logic, right? I mean, if you have any conflict, any sort of disagreement that you have to negotiate within your own home, there's going to be compromise. And why would that not be the case when you're trying to create the legal document that is the basis for all law in a new country, and where you have the economy, which is the source of all your political strength, predicated on slave labor? Of course, you're going to have messiness when you create that legal document. And so I think it goes back again to being willing to say, look, the thing that makes America great and the thing that makes the Constitution great is the principles that we hold up. But how well we hold them up is really the test of whether we remain great. And that's the hard work.
That is the hard work. It's otherwise it's I always think it's always seems lazy to me, right? To say, well, God told, George Washington to not cut down the cherry tree. He, and so we don't have to do anything. But the truth is, we're the ones that are here. We're the ones that are accountable. And so we need to do the hard work, which means understanding truths that we may find uncomfortable. So I want to press on another issue. I know that there are some who want to say that the Civil War and the Southern states, their issue wasn't really slavery. The war wasn't over slavery or the secession. It was over states' rights. I know I'm being sarcastic because I get tired of this, but I want to know if you'll address that, or what are your thoughts about states' rights versus this was really about slavery?
So I mean, I was explicitly taught that in middle school.
Right.
At a public middle school in St. George, Utah. Right. I distinctly remember the teacher hounding that point. So he also, I mean, you could now, I didn't recognize this at the time because I didn't have enough sort of political context to understand where he was coming from. So I was just sort of like, oh, okay, is this gonna be on the test? But at the time, he distinctly said the Civil War was not about slavery, it was about states' rights. He also said that communism was, this is how he described communism. Communism is where, two people have jobs, they get paid the same amount. One of them is a nuclear engineer in charge of a power plant. The other one turns the lights off and on. And that's communism. And he said that without any irony. It's like, that's literally how it plays out. And it's like, look, we can have a critical conversation about communism and where it falls short, because it does, without having to distill it down to these like idiotic narratives, right? And I think that this is, again, it's one of those things where it's a convenient narrative that justifies something that people don't want to be true and they don't want to confront because they think that it means something about them. If I were to recognize that there was systemic inequality based on race in this country, and I'm a white male, you could lead to one of two conclusions there, maybe more, but one of those is, hey, as somebody who's been, not had the playing field tilted against them with regard to my race, maybe other things, maybe my family wasn't wealthy and so I didn't have advantages that a wealthy family did. There's still a socioeconomic hierarchy within maybe white people, but I certainly haven't had people look at me and go, oh, well, you're black, therefore you're going to have these other disadvantages heaped upon you. I could look at that and say, okay, well, let me be honest about this and see if there's something that can be done to make this better, to get us true to our principles. Or you could get really defensive and you can look for ways to justify that. And if you're looking for a story and a narrative to justify why you don't have to worry about something, you're going to find it. Someone will serve it up to you. And when people serve up bad faith narratives designed to placate you and make you feel better about something that's not true, they have something to gain. There's always power to be amassed, money to be made, political offices to be won by telling people what they want to hear and stoking the crowd, right? And I think that's where this stuff comes from, is that there are some people who fundamentally will not address reality. They maybe don't know. They're parroting things that they've heard. There are also people who recognize that telling people what they want to hear is a pretty good racket.
Yes, doTERRA. Oh, sorry. Okay. I love this conversation. So So the Civil War was about states' rights, yes or no?
No, no. I mean, I think the only way you could spin that is to say, hey, the states wanted to have the right to continue slavery. I
That's
mean, it
right.
was
I mean, what? That's right. Oh, I
yeah,
love it.
yeah. Anyway, I just think that's an open and shut. Like if you understand, kind of the even the most superficial kind of facts about that time period, the central conflict was slavery. And had been a conflict. It was a conflict that was part of even the separation from Great Britain. It was a
Right.
source of consternation with Britain. Like you can't
It
do
was a
this anymore.
long issue.
Yep.
So in our modern day, and I noticed in the meeting I had earlier this week, there was a discussion about some comments from, excuse me, some of our legislature. Now, this could be true in any state, but we know we're in Utah, so um, there was a political leader, I'm not sure who it was, who said something like, we can't talk about critical race theory, or he's afraid of critical race theory or something, because our country was not built on equity, but was built on equality, meaning in his mind, equality means you're starting from the same place and then you can, work up from there, pull up your bootstraps. Are you familiar with that article? And if you are, could you expound on what that was about, and even what we mean by equity versus equality?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that exact reference, but I think it's been a pretty common line of discussion around this issue. Is one of the central narratives is the American dream. There's this level playing field, and anybody who wants to put in the work can reap the rewards. And I think that's partially true, right? We do have opportunity here that I think exists in spades compared to a lot of other places. I mean, in China, you can start a company, and if you're successful, the state comes in and takes it from you. If we were to have that kind of heavy-handedness here, like our economy would really struggle, and people would be totally disincentivized from putting any effort into like gambling a good idea in the marketplace. But here again, I think you can look at two realities that coexist at the same time. Yes, we have more freedom and more opportunity, more upside here than any place in the world, but you also have hundreds of years of policy decisions, legal precedents, social movements that have seriously disadvantaged groups of people based on their race, right? And so I think that this comes down, the language I prefer to use here is the equality of opportunity versus equality of result. I don't feel like I wouldn't want to live in a place that that mandated equality of result, where everybody gets the same thing no matter what you put in, because I think that does disincentivize people from trying to contribute. I personally think there should be a floor. Your basic human, we have enough wealth now that your basic human rights, food, shelter, medical care, those things should come with the territory, right?
Amen.
But the upside from there should be like, hey, how much do you want to put in? You can get it back out. But that's not true. There is not equality of opportunity here for everybody equally. I think there are major systemic disadvantages to, for example, not having family wealth to rely on, to being seen as, to walking into a job interview and like having a strike against you because of the color of your skin, because there are biases that are perpetuated by certain people, or because you live in a certain part of town and you've been predisposed to crime. That is the only way that people are able to make ends meet, because there's no legitimate industry for them to participate in. And that's happened for years or generations, right? These are generational problems that are the result of policy decisions, and they have stacked the playing field against, in particular, people of color. And so I think the conversation, ought to be about, we're not looking here for equality of result. We're looking for equality of opportunity, and we're not there. We have work to do to get there.
So one of the areas that relate to policy that I've heard discussed regarding critical race theory and just where these policies have gone wrong, where I lived for my church mission was in Virginia and West Virginia. I was in an area in Roanoke, and I was in the ghetto, literally, of Roanoke. And white Baptists did not want to talk to Mormons. So the only place that we would go that we felt welcome really were in black neighborhoods and in the ghetto. And I can remember meeting with, knocking on the door, and a woman with her kids opened the door, and they were ranged from 5 to 17, the 17-year-old boy, and then like a 13-year-old girl, etc. And we're like, hey, do you want to hear about Jesus? And she's nice, wants to talk to us. So we come back. She invites us back another day, and when we come back, her little girl, her 13-year-old, had been raped by an uncle. And I was like, I grew up in Provo, Utah, where there's nothing like that happens. I have no clue. I'm totally, culture shocked. And she had no recourse. There wasn't a way to hold. I think that they told the police, but who knows where this uncle went? And that was a common thing for them, And so, in my ignorance, and I'm really, ashamed to say that I was trying to like encourage her about her future. I don't know what I was thinking, but I just said, so what, there's still a future. What do you want to do for school? What do you want to do for your education? And she said, we're not going to go to college. If I get pregnant and I'm not married at age 17, I'll get on welfare. And if I have a second child before I'm 18 and I'm not married, I'll get my own flat, my own apartment. And I was like, holy cow. I have no idea what this is about. I have no idea how welfare works. Do you have a sense of how welfare has contributed, or are there racist policies in welfare, or is that something you can speak to or have thoughts about?
Yeah, first of all, it's awful. And as a young kid on a church mission, a religious mission, you're not equipped to deal with that kind of stuff, and neither is a 13-year-old who has to experience it. And
neither was her mother.
Right, and these are the kinds of real, horrors that I think ought to be dominating our conversation instead of the made up horrors. I think that's the first point. Like, we have a lot of boogeymen that we chase, and it just distracts from the real human suffering that we could be alleviating if people were to focus. And the way that I look at that, again, there's certainly gaps in what I know about this. I'm not going to purport to be like someone who studies this, full time, but I think when you look at, I read a book a while ago that talked about the kind of the number one antidote for breaking a lot of social problems, including, drug trade and a lot of the problems that happen, like you just mentioned, where you've got crimes that happen within families or within communities, is economic opportunity. If you can create sustainable economic growth where everyone feels like they have a chance to contribute and receive benefits from it, then they put their energy into that kind of stuff. If they don't see that opportunity, if they see cycle after cycle of like, what's the use, they turn their attention to other things, and you get a lot of antisocial behavior, and you get a lot of kind of extra legal behavior as well. And so, if you're in a situation, there are certainly people who are very advantaged who do terrible things like that as well. So I don't know that it's like a product of the environment that this girl would experience being raped at a young age, but her view on what her future holds is absolutely something that was modeled to her. And that's a product of, I don't think welfare, but that's a product of her not seeing like an economic path forward for her. Am I going to go to college? Am I going to be able to get into college? If I go to college and get a degree, am I going to be able to get a job? Can you even go to college if you can't afford it? Like, what are you actually putting up as collateral to get a loan? Like, there's all these questions that you run into. And if you don't have resources and you've been deprived of that through generations of, again, policies that stacked against the deck against you, it's really hard to break out of that. You have it happen sometimes, but you haven't seen the path. First of all, you don't maybe have a mechanism to get there. But even if you could, you can't visualize it because you've never seen it before. You know, you might be able to see what your parents did and emulate that and try to, that's kind of during your formative years, though that's what life looks like when I get older. Can you visualize something different than that? Not if you're not exposed to something else. And if a contributing factor to what you experience in your formative years is economic poverty and socioeconomic kind of classism that puts you into a disadvantage, you're probably going to repeat that disadvantaged lifestyle. So I think,
well, you know, and yeah, not only did she have this view of her future, as you mentioned, but she also had a view of society, that
yeah,
society wasn't there to help her, right?
yeah,
So what what happened with this uncle, her experience with the police that interviewed her, did she get follow-up health care, right? I mean, as an adult now, with a healthcare, you know, career, I have a lot of questions about that, what happened, you know, but what I do know is that there seemed to be a lack of interest in that community. Like the
yeah,
police just kind of tolerated them. I mean, like I said, they investigated, but it never went anywhere. And I can remember when we would walk into those neighborhoods, the police would stop us and say, "You guys shouldn't be going into those neighborhoods." And I'm like, "Well, these other neighborhoods kicked us out." So
touche.
and we were fine. I mean, obviously we were fine. And again, we were welcomed, but I had no idea what really happened. I mean, that was a huge eye-opening experience for me and probably set me on a path about racial equality and just the systemic problems. And I think
Yeah,
what I'd add, maybe those who might be listening who are afraid of critical race theory, they are afraid that it means something will be taken away from them or whatever. What I want to say is that what we're talking about here is not about you, me as individuals, or Brad as an individual. It is about um, recognizing where our institutions still have or um, or are going to have racial inequality built into the system. So if it helps for you to think about the audience, if it helps for you to think about, we're trying to focus on our organizations and our institutions. We're not trying to make you feel guilty or make anybody pay the price for something you didn't do, but we all have to come together to recognize where our systems, our government, our organizations have institutionalized, created policies, or are continuing to try to do that in a way that creates inequality for any groups. This includes Native Americans, Asian Americans. It includes the queer community and women, right? And how are women treated and have equal opportunities as well. But if we can focus on not individuals, but on our institutions, we can make it better.
yeah, it's really well said. And I think it goes back again to, you know, what are the principles that we all resonate to? And you can objectively try to hold any institution to that. Like, I think, you know, we started this conversation with religion, and there's this old Christian idea of idolatry. And
Mm-hmm.
it's one of those things that's boiled down to, well, you shouldn't worship a golden calf. Like it's about literally looking at something that is a graven image and worshiping that instead of God, and God's jealous. And I think about it differently. I think about it as anytime you transfer your loyalty into something other than the principle and into some, sorry about
So
that.
you were saying that where you cut out was about the idol, kind of
Yeah.
making a comparison there.
Hopefully I'll make this leap to what you're talking about. But again, like if you thought about like God as the embodiment of principles and incorruptible principles, right? And then the idol represents what we do with that. All too often we place our loyalty into an institution or a thing or a person. And so it's like, this politician is the person I put my faith in, and no matter what they do, you know, I support them. Well, why would you not say, hey, this person more or less supports the principles that I agree with, but I'm going to hold them to account to the ones that they're not reflecting, my beliefs in? Why wouldn't you say, hey, this person is a complex individual with a range of strengths and weaknesses? Why would you not do that with an institution? Why would you not say, hey, America is great because of its principles, and if I'm going to be patriotic, it's my duty to hold that country and its institutions and its people to those principles, instead of saying no matter what we do as Americans, we're great. If you're in a religion that believes that it's exceptional, why would you not say our exceptional nature is based on our principles? And again, like, to the extent that our people our practices are not in line with that, I'm going to demand accountability to those principles. And I think that's the case here with critical race theory, where you say we use the platitude all the time, like, those who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. Well, we repeat this over and over again. Racial inequality is recycled generation after generation, and we are still 2.5 centuries later trying to live up to the ideals that were articulated in the Declaration of Independence. We're not there still. So that tells me there's still work to do. It doesn't mean that I have to feel bad about something that cotton farmers did back in the 1700s or the 1800s. It doesn't mean that I have to feel bad about my grandfather living in a community that was sort of colored by the Confederacy. It just means that I have to look at things with fresh eyes and say, what can I do to make things better? Like, we're all trying to make a better society, right? That's the point. It can always be better. It can always be truer to principles. And I think that's the battle.
It's interesting because those who claim American exceptionalism or religious exceptionalism oftentimes do not behave exceptionally.
Right. It's a good observation.
Yeah. So as we kind of, how are you doing on time? Do you have a few more minutes for
I'm good.
A wrap-up question? And I think we can always come back. There's a lot we've talked about, and we can do follow-up episodes. I know that I do have a group that listens pretty religiously, that are atheists, who what I think they might say is those principles are embedded in who we are as humans, right? From a humanist perspective, we can do the work to raise the bar for us as humans, right? It's about, and however you want to look at that, it is about progressing and improving and doing better. So that leads me into my last question for you. How do we move forward? How do we progress on the issue of racial equality?
So I tend to think about this through, there's really 3 pillars with anything where you're trying to move large groups of people along. There's the narrative, there's the initiatives, and then there's the policy. And I don't think you can work on the initiatives or the policy until you've won the narrative. Right now, we're having a massive battle over the narrative. And the narrative right now is being hijacked by a whole bunch of bad faith attempts to leverage people's emotions, use a time-tested trick of they're coming for you, they're coming for your kids, they're coming for your neighborhood, this they that you should be afraid of, and project that fear onto people so that they can maintain, say, hey, I'll take care of it. I'll protect you from these people that you don't want coming for your community or your kids. And I think that we've got to win that narrative. There's got to be, we need a return to some thoughtful debate. There has to be, in this age of social media, we have to demand more out of people. Like, if you're going to believe something, there's got to be substance to it. Otherwise, I think we need to reject those notions. We need to have respect for people, and I think we need to do this in a way that is productive and not, tearing people down. But I think we need to get control of a narrative and get people inspired around the idea that debate is good, discussion is good, as long as it's in good faith and as long as you're rooted in fact. Let's have the discussion. If we can get more momentum around a reasonable fact-based discussion, then I think you can start getting into initiatives that say, okay, if we can agree on some basic facts, and the facts overwhelmingly, objectively lead you to the reality and the realization that systemic racism is part of the inheritance that we have to deal with today, What are the initiatives that would attack that problem in a way that makes sense? And what are the policies that extend from that, where you say, okay, what can be done? Let's not just do things for the sake of doing them. Let's not do things because we feel guilty. Let's just try to solve the problem. Let's get to the root cause. Let's figure out what we can do. And that doesn't mean that you're going to suddenly like be shifting people's incomes around to other economic groups. It doesn't mean that, you know, you're going to have to be taxed out the nose because we're going to do reparations. There's a lot of ways to deal with this kind of thing that think about the future and don't have to, you know, make up for 400 years of systemic problems overnight. But I do think that it starts with just having more momentum around a reasonable fact-based conversation.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. So to add to that, I think one of another journey we can all individually take is to, and I hope listeners and viewers tonight will do the same thing. And it really is taking time to understand how you identify, right? If I pause for a second and think about how do I identify, you know, do I identify as a father? Do I identify as a white male? And as I've gone through that exercise and began to think about how I identify, it becomes clear to me that I have had advantages that others haven't had. And it has been easy for me, even in my own community, regardless of race. I have had problems in the past in my thinking where I have said, well, that person, is maybe one of my in-laws is constantly impoverished. So I think, well, just pull up your bootstraps. But
Yeah.
when and fix that. But when I think about my identity and what makes me who I am, if I really push through how I identify, I'm not just a father. I am the son of a businessman who won the Businessman of the Year award 2 years in a row from President Ford. My mother, the first woman to receive the Businessman of the Year. Because of her, that name was changed to Business People of the Year from the president. I had privilege, and I had a community, a Mormon community around me that did provide support for me. Now, again, I know there are people who don't feel that way. I did, and I know that that's part of my identity. And when I start to individually think about my identity, it doesn't mean that I'm wrong or that I should feel guilty for how I was raised. It just helps me to recognize, first of all, embrace my own identity, but also understand that there are other identities. People have not had that same background. I think for you, Brad, I don't know what it's like to go through a divorce. That probably could disadvantage you, right? I didn't have a divorced parent. My parents stayed together. I have other things in my family life that might disadvantage me. But when I take a minute and think, how do I identify? I have to think about the things that have happened in my life that have helped define who I am. Some are good and some aren't so good. And what I hope that does for our listeners and our viewers is creates empathy. I can have empathy for those who have had a different experience than I have, right?
Yeah. Yeah, really well said. And again, just tying this back to where we started with sort of like a Mormon idiom, one of our hymns talks about, because I've been given much, I too must give. And this is a scriptural theme. You hear a lot about people who had things, who had been given, or had been maybe not just given. Again, they had worked for these things, but yet societies in this Book of Mormon, story, that the warning was always, well, you're not looking out for the disadvantaged and the marginalized. And I think that's always the call for people who follow like the truth of the Christian tradition. And this is true in other religions as well. Like, you have to recognize power imbalances. It's always on a scale. It's not a binary thing. Some of us, are given certain advantages and disadvantages from the time we're born. But we can always look for people who have been disadvantaged more than us and try to rectify that. We'd want the same for us.
We would want the same for us, right? Because if I ended up in a disadvantaged situation, I would want to know that I'm, that there will be a social construct that will support me.
Right.
But I haven't been in that situation, right? Like the 13-year-old I met in Roanoke, Virginia.
Yeah. Deck stacked.
Yep, deck stacked. Anything else that you want to share with the audience, Brad?
No, I'm just glad you do this, Gary. I mean, there's sort of a vacuum of long form conversation to get into nuances of things that really matter. And so appreciate you doing this and hope you keep it going.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I'm trying to accomplish is, I want to maintain an eclectic audience.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I want to speak to the atheists that are listening, the agnostics, and also the Mormons, whether they're true believing or whether they're progressive or they're just not sure where they're at, as well as Christians, because and any background, because I think if we can show that we can have a dialogue, and we can be respectful of all of our different backgrounds. And I think what was powerful today, Brad, is that we can um, speak truth to error that we've experienced in our own lives, in our own religion. We're not apologizing for that. We're not apologists. We are acknowledging what happened, and we are on board with helping make the future a better place. We're humanists. And yes, you can be a humanist and be an atheist. You can also be a humanist and a Mormon, or a
Yeah.
humanist and a Jehovah's Witness. I don't know. So I want all viewers that are partaking and listening to feel included. I want this to be about inclusion. Otherwise, we'll continue to create division, and we'll continue to say, well, you have to get rid of this group of people in order to fix the problem, right?
Yeah.
Or this belief system or whatever. I believe that data-driven and evidence-based critical thinking can be engaged from in amongst all of our different backgrounds, all of our ethnicities, political backgrounds, and religious backgrounds. And I'll say this, I want to say this other thing, Brad, because this kind of conversation needs to be heard amongst all of these different communities, right? That there are Mormon friends and family that you have that could listen to this and say, "Oh, wow, you can be a true believing Mormon, active Mormon like Brad Prothow, and also understand that the Civil War was about slavery and not
Right.
about states' rights." Right? You don't have a revisionist history in your mind. You have a humanist way, or or Christ-like way, however you want to frame it, to move forward into making the world a better place. So I'd say all that to ask you, Brad, and any viewers to share with your friends and family this video and this content, because our goal is to help make the world a better place, in a evidence-based direction.
Yeah, I love it.
So
Well said.
please, yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to let you go, Brad. With much love to you and your family. Oh, by the way, I did want to shout out. Did we talk about, you have 3 kids?
4 kids.
Four
Yep.
kids. Do you want to shout out to your family or?
Yep. My wife, Stephanie, and then 4 kids. Avery's 13, Abby's 11, Cameron is 8, and then Ainsley is 4, almost 5.
What a wonderful blessing to have you as their father. And
Someday.
well, I'm just glad that they can hear some evidence-based truth from you. That'll mean a lot to them in the future. So with
Yeah.
that said, peace out, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.